I'm here talking with Michael McMaster. Hi, Mike. Good to see you.
You too. Looking
And
forward to it.
we are going to speak for a while this morning about this idea of attractors, which is a concept from complexity theory that can be applied very successfully to organization and organization design. So, I'd like, Mike, if you would just give a little bit of framework for people who may not know a lot about either of those topics. What is the whole idea of an attractor? What does it mean? And why does that matter in an organizational context?
Okay. So the first assumption is for an organization, but for a complex adaptive system as well, of any kind, that there is a boundary. So you know what's inside and what's outside. And what's inside is people in an organization, people, energy, moving around. And what the system's designed for is, as it says, complex adaptive systems. It's designed for continually developing patterns to make your system, your organization in this case, more adaptive. But let me go back to a purely physical thing as an example. And that is, suppose you've got energy, some form of energy that you're shooting into your system, and meaning in the container box that it's in, if you like. And what you do is you put 4 magnets, more or less equal strength, and more or less towards the corners, but not fully in the corners of this square. And so those are magnets. And they're either attracting or repelling. And inside of that, the energy is bouncing around. But because it's contained, it keeps bouncing. So it keeps developing changing patterns. And that's so attractors, everybody understands magnets, and they repel or attract. And if you have a few of them and you chuck something into the mix, it bounces around trying to stabilize, but it can't because these attractors keep pulling it one way or another. So that's the kind of a visual, physical metaphor for attractors. Now, in our case, the energy is human beings. It's coming from human beings. I mean, never mind the gas and oil, we know how they work. But all of the creativity, all of the ability to adapt is human beings are the source of energy for that. And now we still want 4 attractors. And 4 is because 4 is very common in this large field of science and philosophy and things. But basically 4, if you only have 1, 2, or 3, we can figure them out using linear thinking. By the time you add the 4th one, it gets to be shifting patterns, and no, you can't nail it down, and so you can't control it in the old linear ways anymore. So it has to be 4, and it can be more, but I recommend just 4 is good enough to start. So what are the attractors in a human system, in an organization? And the attractors are basically one of 3 categories, preferably a mix of these 3 categories. One of them is values. One of them is operational principles. And one of them is intent focus. And another one, so it couldn't be any of these 4, not necessarily all 4 of these different ones. And the other one is you have designed linear processes inside of your system that you want to maintain, and they're important. Let's say it's for safety. We got systems for safety, and they need to be taken into account while these other ones are playing around, kind of thing. So between the 4 of them, new patterns will keep emerging. And eventually, and sometimes they'll all cluster to one space and you have to adjust it. Some of the agents, like the individuals in this case, are going to get kicked out of the system, sometimes by accident, sometimes because they're fighting the system and it kills them off. That is, it bumps them outside, go work, go play outside. So that's pretty much when we say attractors are needed. If there's no attractors there, or if there's one strong attractor, then everything clumps there and then nothing moves again. But this is a living system and an intelligent living system. So it's like somebody has said, complexity means, rather than chaos, rather than rigidity, complexity means moving patterns. So while there's patterns, you can't grab it and say, oh, this is it, because it's going to keep moving.
Mike, I'd like to step back away from the human, from an organization as a complex adaptive system, to other living systems, to get another example of an attractor, if you have any, like, a school of fish or a forest or,
I'll give you the most popular one in the sort of YouTube-ish kind of thing, and that, which is birds flocking.
Okay.
So how do birds maintain the flock? Well, it's easy enough when you say, so there's a set of rules about how they operate.
Okay.
So the rules count. So the birds have rules, are like always have, sake of argument, always have 6 inches between the one in front and the one to your left or right, like that. And then up and down, and you got that kind of, so you don't need to worry much about flocking. You see geese fly in a V. Well, they just fly in the V until they come around a telephone pole or such. And then you go, what do? Are 3 of them going to crash into the telephone pole trying to keep this balance, the rules? So another rule is when something's in your way, you go whatever's left or right, depending on where you are. Are you on the edges of the flock or the middle, stuff like that. So the birds will split when they come to the post, and then there's a rule of coming back to where they were. So they're now trying to establish the sideways space, if you like. And the thing is, you can run that on a computer and watch a flock of birds, which are just, total group of dots following the rules. And you look, this swoop, and they dive, and they separate around obstacles, and you see it. And it's as simple as 4 rules is all they need to do that.
Would another attractor be that the flock, so there's the rules for behavior while flying in a flock.
Yeah.
But then those, it seems like those 4 rules aren't for attractors. Those are the rules. I thought that a set of rules was a separate attractor in and of itself, and there were other kinds of things that equal detractors. Like, for example, in the case of a flock of birds, it would be the instinctual need to migrate at a certain time of year. Would that be in the category of an attractor in this case?
It probably comes in there. This thing I just said was because it demonstrates, you watch it and you get it in that sense. But it's also limited. It's only a flocking. It's 4 attractors for flocking work.
Okay.
Not for the birds. So then you've got, okay, what are the attractors? Well, food, heading south or north or not, things like that. And they're attractors based on something we don't much know. But they're still always flocking. How is a leader detected? Who, when they land outside my window here, I'm on the edge of the ocean, and there's seagulls. And you can see them moving around and hassling each other over areas of food. And there's whole sets of things going on that are fun to watch. But those are as far as, they're less like rules. But why I'm saying it the way it's more like the values and things. The thing is, that set of rules creates flocking behavior in a bunch of robots.
Uh-huh.
It's not what the birds are doing. The birds are just doing it, sort of thing, and that's already built in. So, but you now take probably any ecology of forest, plants, a larger complex thing. You can't manage a whole bunch of things. Like there's 100 attractors in there, but if that's all we see, to us it's just chaos. But if we look at it, it's not actually quite organized. Just that we can't kind of keep track of it, but we can see shifting patterns in an ecology. You set a camera up in the woods and have it sit there for a decade, and you see taller growth of trees, then a forest fire that clears some out, new growth comes in there, and some species, animal or plant, comes in from the outside. That's all of a sudden a factor that the interactions change.
So let's go back up the ladder of complexity
Yep.
to human organizations again, as we complete this introduction to the whole idea of attractors. Are there any organizations that don't have them, or are they there and they're not named? Or what's the how to say this? If you're armed with this idea, what do you see that you wouldn't have seen otherwise?
If you haven't thought about it, there's starting places. So one is, I call it a setup outside the system, and that is, as a system, it has a purpose. The purpose usually in the animal world, et cetera, is just surviving, right? So there's a certain, we do stuff to survive. But in an organization, we'll call it a vision or a long-term purpose, or however you like to talk about those things. So there's one guiding principle that's outside of the four, which will be, okay, how do we manipulate stuff to always be able to meet that or forward that vision? So that's there because we're intelligent. We can keep that in our minds while we bounce around inside the other. Then, if you think of an organization in its beginning, it's a phrase I use, that's frozen accidents, which are like frozen attractors. That is, things started around somebody, around a small group. It's not till it gets to a size that's beyond personal influence and understanding. So that might be a few hundred people. Up till then, a strong CEO, he gets a good management team around him, and they communicate a lot, and they know where they're going, and they, works out. But as it begins to develop, somewhere around a couple of hundred people, the CEO will, we've both seen it, will come to us and go, this is kind of getting out of control, and there's things I don't like how they're going, but I don't really know what to do because there's too many different things to do. And that's where part of them, I say, like we call them in the theory, frozen accidents. Somebody said something, or do something, don't do something, and it became a rule. So I was in a smelting operation with Kaminko up here, and I was saw guys who were on a kind of conveyor belt line, and they were pouring metal into little bins, and they went a little train track through to the next place. And the next place they went through a hole in the wall. And I said to the guys there, so what happens the other side of the wall? They go, we don't know. Why should we know? Like that. So now the wall is there, but the processes will change and all different things can happen. Is that really smart anymore? Nobody thinks about it. It's just the way it is. So it's become essentially an extra frozen attractor. It's just there. So that's my first move always, is spot the obstacles and get rid of them. And it's what generally the higher up people in the organization resist like crazy, because then they say, well, we don't have control. But you never have control. You only have influence.
Well, let's go back. Let's build on that idea with you for a second as we wrap this introduction up. It seems to me then that what you're suggesting, that unlike a flock of birds where the attractors and the rules are genetically encoded,
yeah.
A human organization, a social entity, at a certain scale, it gets dynamically complex enough that trying to organize it by hierarchical or linear control mechanisms is counterproductive, and that you're suggesting that you could organize and coordinate it by thoughtfully creating a set of at least 4, quote, attractors that as they're disseminated and people actually adopt them, could then start to coordinate the action without so much linear management control. Is that a good way to think about this?
Yes, because now here are the principles, if you like. Here are the values. Here are some fundamental things. Always keep them in mind. And if you haven't done it before, it'll take some work. You know, you have to see, oh, if we say that, it stymies people. Well, we need to change it. But you're going to also have levels, like each one of those can have 4 of its attractors treated, but it's got to be organized in its own internal hierarchy, not from external.
Got it. Well, this is a beginning of a longer and deeper conversation about intentionally using the idea of attractors to create intelligent, resilient, adaptive organizations. And so we'll talk some more about this in the next part of this series. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, thank you.
So, Mike, we have been talking about this idea borrowed or brought in from complexity theory called attractors. And the way I've been learning from you about how to think about this phenomena is that an attractor in a complex adaptive system influences the system to coordinate itself without someone or someone's telling the system what to do. The system in a certain way tells itself what to do because the attractors galvanize or help coordinate patterns. So tell me how well I got it or how well I didn't get it.
It's pretty good. It's certainly useful. Yeah, until something influences them, human beings, me in this case, the intelligent beings who supply the energy to the system, if you just toss them in with nothing like an attractor or that, they bounce around. Way back in the 60s and 70s, I worked with leaderless groups and how you lead leaderless groups, which was mainly you did still have to lead them or nothing happened because there's nothing for them to coalesce around. And if you say, okay, but it has a purpose, an overall purpose, this leaderless group is here to do something, then it gets much better. But it still goes crazy because there'll be disagreement on many different items and levels, but not the key ones. It'll be my key one I'll be focusing on, and you'll focus on your key one. And Crazy George down there will have a totally different one, and so it's very inefficient at best and kind of unreliable because there won't be a real pattern coming out of it. And what you'll end up with is a fixed, okay, we'll do it this way now. But now the moving pattern's gone. Now it's turned linear and command and control and all kinds of stuff. So the key is to get that it's moving patterns continuously. And it's not done by command and control for sure, but it's also not done by a hierarchy. It's done by the 4 biggest influences that if you pay attention to them, will create continually moving patterns, but you'll see them as the same patterns, transforming, moving, changing. And what you do with the patterns is, as long as you want the systems to run, eventually it'll come up with a project, say. And now you'll take your project and put it into a project form, which may also be use this stuff, but now it'll be different things because you're building towards something. So key is, do we know what we're focused on here? Without that, it'll be sort of a fairly dumb response to those attractors, if we call them rules or values, whatever. But if we know what we're focused on, now we can begin to judge, as I balance these 4 forces acting on me, it'll stay loose and creative. That's where innovation will occur. as soon as we grab around an attractor or, somehow freeze, and we're all settled now, we'll go to attractor number 3 and forget the rest because this is most important. All the life will go out of it, all the creativity, and really the intelligence will disappear. Because intelligence is the constantly moving introduction of new stuff and rejecting stuff and all of it, but it just keeps moving. So I think that's only part way to a response. I'm not sure.
No, things are clarifying for me. One of the thoughts that I had earlier when you were talking about what you call frozen accidents, which were basically attractors that had been put in place in the past for whatever reason, but hadn't been attended to as to whether or not they were still fluid, whether or not they were still relevant. The frame I would draw around this conversation, Mike, again, you can correct me if I'm not getting it, but the frame that I'm thinking in is that this is a frame called organization design for effectiveness, organization design for intelligence or adaptability. Is that
for innovation or for, yeah.
So, but that does imply a designer or a design team. So is that part of the idea here, is that organizations, to stay resilient and continually evolving, someone needs to be attending to the attractors, which are a big part of the design. Is that a fair statement in your view?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we have unclear distinctions in much of industry between manager and supervisor.
Okay.
And for me, a supervisor is someone who works with people doing the actual work, whatever it is.
Yeah.
To, help them, help coordinate it, have it all be better. A manager is actually to keep watch over the system, over the design of the organization, and go, wait a minute, either our attractors are wrong or insufficient, or too many or too little, or there's something we haven't thought about yet because we're not getting the patterns we want. We're not getting the innovation we want, whatever you call it. All of, anywhere from entrepreneur to innovator to whatever, it has a certain design. And the design, because it's the nature of the system, a complex adaptive system, that doesn't change much. Where it's focused is, and what it pays attention, what we pay attention to once we're in it, is what makes the difference. And that's the manager's job, in my view.
Whether people hear manager as a lower level than executive or leader, but I think you mean it a little more fluidly than that. Any level.
Yep.
So you raised a really interesting point here. I'm thinking, well, how would I know whether or not my attractors are the right ones, or the ones that we've inherited, or are they still functional? I guess where I look is I look at the measures of success that have been defined, but are the measures themselves sometimes frozen accidents, so that I'm not really looking at the right things?
Well, that's often true, that they've become frozen accidents, what we should be aiming at, rather than the organization, the way I use the word organization, and therefore you organize towards some objective or other. But organization refers to coordinated action, not just a bunch of people running around doing something. I'm going, and there can be levels of, if I'm on a small project team, here is my organization, is it coordinated towards my team's goal? And at a different level, are my team's goals coordinated with other teams to produce a bigger result? And if they're not coordinated all the way up to the real end result, like products to customers, satisfaction, etc., then we know we need to adjust something. And often it is those lower goals that have been set and kept in place. Or budgets are famous. Well, I got a budget. Yeah, is it producing you the result you want? Well, I don't know. I just got a budget. I can't. Well, that's That's sort of a frozen accident in an area.
I can hear some people saying, yeah, this is all great, but the only person that gets to choose about what our budget or whether we have budgets or, how those sorts of decisions are generally pretty high up the political power hierarchy in any organization. A supervisor, a manager, a mid-level manager wouldn't be able to say, you know what, budgets are dysfunctional. We need to be having our attention on something else rather than these budget numbers. But in a large organization, that person doesn't get that option. How do you talk about that as a very practical matter?
Well, to put it in a bit of a category, I'd say, even though it changes from time to time, it's a frozen accident. That is, the frozen part is, I got no say in that. Okay, then you have to deal with that. Nevertheless, so ideally, we get to work, whoever's doing it gets to work high enough in the organization that they're dealing with a level that can change the rules about that, if you like. Should you throw out budgets totally? No. Should you limit your creative ability, your intelligence of the organization just to keep a budget? No. But then how do you deal with it? Well, that's called the kind of problem you should deal with at whatever level it should be dealt with. But my view is, okay, there's frozen accidents all around us, like that wall I referred to earlier. Well, budgets and how I can't. My beginning background was a CPA, so I got to say it. Budgets are crap. Because you don't know when you start what they are, and you hope they fall in a certain range. And if they don't, being the accountant of the company, my job was to explain why we didn't make it. That's it. It was useless and stupid, and other people got beat up because they didn't. All stupid. So is it still there if it's a big organization? Okay, it's there. And I'll make it or not, and I'll do whatever or not. I have a favorite term. This is I don't know about it in complex adaptive systems theory, but in human theory, is put a ring fence around what you want to do. Meaning those rules don't apply to this project. And get somebody to defend you on that or protect you or however you think about it. And then get to work.
Well, I think I want to pivot on that idea and maybe wrap this section up. And I think we'll have at least one or two more on this topic, Mike.
Okay.
But it seems to me that in terms of applying this idea drawn from complexity science to organization design, that I would see, I'm drawing two conclusions. One is, the person who wanted to start thinking this way or start working this way would look around them and say, well, what are the attractors that are here? The ones either we've consciously put in place or the frozen accidents from the past that sort of create the patterns that allow or disallow behavior. And so that I could have a map, as it were, of where those magnets are in the box you referred to in our introductory talk a little while ago.
Yeah.
So then you would create a map of existing attractors. Is that a valid way to go?
Yes, it is. I think I'd say it a bit differently that might be more useful to a woman or a man being on the job trying to get some freedom, which would be unless it's clearly the attractor part, unless it's clearly consistent with the goal, small, high or low in the organization, but at least consistent with a higher goal from putting my hands on things. I would treat it like, okay, is it a good attractor or is it not? And if it's there and I can't change it, good, bad, or indifferent, it's just a frozen accident. And you're just going to have to work around it. But you still will have a huge area of freedom no matter what anybody says. And a bit of an aside here, but just to keep it in a pretty pragmatic range. If you want people to be anything outside of the rigid system, that is creative, entrepreneurial, innovative, adaptive, whatever, if you want any of that, they have to have some freedom with some of their time and some budget, small as it might be. Otherwise, nobody's changing. And now you got a rigid system and its intelligence plummets.
This is a great place to pause the conversation because you've pointed us to the larger focus of this, of your work really, which is how can we have more intelligent organizations, which is to say organizations that are more able to see the changing patterns in their environment and adapt to them successfully given what they're organized for.
Yeah.
So I would say this conversation is inside of that larger framework of developing organizational intelligence. And so
let me say one thing.
Yes, please.
That I'm kind of having the feeling more and more, like over the last year or more, that I talk so much about this that I don't talk about the people as such, you know, that are working in the system. And think for a second about what will they contribute or not, but their own levels of satisfaction, happiness, whatever, from doing real work, if they're so restricted that they can't do anything. I mean, you don't need the rest. Free them up some, or you're going to get very little from them, and they're not going to be happy.
Yes. Yes. Well, I shared with you recently Daniel Pink's work on what he calls motivation, and the three factors were autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And we've touched actually on all three of those. We haven't touched on mastery, but autonomy and purpose are part of, you could say, organizing principles for how to have maximizing individual energetic participation in a system.
And I put development in. I said the manager's job was the system, but I didn't say it was only the system. I think it's two things. One is development of people, and the other is the system.
Wow. This has been incredibly interesting. I look forward to our next conversation on this topic, Mike. Thank you.
Good, I do too.